Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Magdisi Street podcast episode. Today, we're very happy to have with us Mehdi Hasan, who's a British American progressive broadcaster, but he's also been a political commentator, a columnist, and he's also the founding member of the media company Zeteo. I'm sure he's well known to most of our viewers. He had the Mehdi Hasan show on Peacock and was also working on MSNBC. He's a columnist at The Guardian. He's worked in many different platforms. But he's also a graduate of Oxford, and at the same time, he also worked at Jazeera, and he's the author of several books, including "Win Every Argument," and he's written a biography of the former Labour Party leader Ed Miliband. Mehdi is somebody that you should all follow on his social medias, on his Twitter and his company. And we're very happy to have him today talking about, in particular, kind of covering Gaza and the US elections as well. So please do listen. And before we start, just another reminder that if you would be so kind as to join the Patreon, you would support the podcast and kind of defray some of the costs that we incur on this show, and so we'd very much appreciate that. And please do, if you can as well, put some 5-star review so that the show can reach other audiences members as well. So thank you, and see you soon. So Mahdi, welcome to our show. We're really pleased to have you. We always start these podcasts by getting the guest, in this case you, to just tell us a little bit about how you came to be the journalist that you are, your sort of backstory. And everybody, of course, most of our viewers are going to know who you are, but sort of some of your backstory would be really interesting to have.
Well, Kareem, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here with the three of you. I don't normally get interviewed by three people. It feels like a job interview right now with the three of you staring at the screens, and definitely never been interviewed by three brothers before, so let's see how this goes. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, my name is Mehdi Hasan. I'm the editor-in-chief, CEO of a company called Zeteo, which I founded earlier this year after I left MSNBC. I've been a journalist now, kills me to say this, for 24 years, nearly quarter of a century. I have worked on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm a brown guy. I'm the child of Indian immigrants to the UK. My mother is a doctor. My father is an engineer, cliched Indian professionals, and yet both their kids are journalists. We are huge disappointments to our parents that neither of us became doctors. I kind of fell into journalism because I didn't know what else to do. I was a producer. I worked behind the scenes for about almost a decade. And then about 2009-10, I became the political editor of a magazine called The New Statesman, a British centre-left magazine. And I started ending up on TV shows and radio and kind of became the kind of big mouth public figure pundit / opinionator that people know me as today. I moved to the US in 2015 for Al Jazeera English. And ever since then, I've worked for Jazeera, The Intercept, MSNBC, and now, as I say, my own company, Zeteo.
Great. So let me just push you a little bit on this. The idea that, as you said, you're a brown person. We're all brown people in this sense. How is it that you've managed to kind of, for example, in covering the genocide itself now, covering this genocide as a brown person, from let's say from a location of descent, in a sense, from the mainstream, and of course you've presented in the mainstream for quite a long time, as you said, in NBC or MSNBC, and now you have your own thing where you can write what you want, say what you want. Can you tell us a little bit more how you went from one to the other, and what the differences are in terms of how you cover it?
It's a great question. I've always seen myself straddling the divide between outside and inside. So the fact that I'm now quote unquote outside is not that shocking to me, because even when I was inside, I was outside. And it's some, and people don't necessarily get this unless they've actually, walked in some of our shoes and worked in some of the places that we've worked in. But, I joined the media as a 21-year-old lefty Muslim Oxford graduate private school boy. So I had both of that within me. I was very establishment in the sense that I went to a private boys' school in the UK. I went to Christchurch, Oxford. I did PPE, the degree that British prime ministers do. So I was very establishment in that sense. But I was also the child of immigrants, the Muslim, very opinionated on politics, very left. And so I've always been kind of, walking that tightrope between being part of the mainstream and the establishment, but also, to use your phrase, dissenting, saying in meetings, this is not the right thing to do. Saying inside of corporate media, why are we covering the story in this way? That's wrong. That's inaccurate. That's biased. And then, getting my own platform to be able to say it publicly. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey where, even in the UK, I wrote a biography of the Labour Party leader, but I was always very critical of Labour and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown over their Iraq policies, immigration, etc. And even when I moved to the US, I moved to the US with Al Jazeera English. I could have moved with HuffPost, who I was working for at the time, but I'm glad I ended up in the US with Al Jazeera because, again, it gave me that outside perch perspective. That's how people got to know me, right? Most people in the mainstream US media actually know me from Eric Prince interview that I did at the Oxford Union for head-to-head at Al Jazeera English. So I was actually kind of proud of that. It's always kept me in good stead. But even when I was at NBC or when I worked at Sky News, owned by Rupert Murdoch at the time, I was still saying and doing what I wanted to do. But obviously you have to navigate this stuff carefully. And I see too many people on the left or from a Muslim or Arab or Desi background, getting involved in mainstream media and then crashing and burning because, it was a hard tightrope to walk. And look, I walked it till the age of 44 years old. I walked it till October 7th. I walked it for 3.5 years at MSNBC, where I did get to say what I wanted to say. I did get to do what I wanted to do. And I was able to do primetime shows. There were moments when I would think, they're letting me do Rachel Maddow's show tonight? That's kind of weird. It's like your parents giving you the keys to the nice car and let you take it for a spin. So, yeah, touch wood, mashallah, whatever phrase you want to use. I managed to pull off that tightrope walking out for quite a long time. But now, look, even with my current company, Kareem, I'm not saying burn down all the media. I think there's a lot of people in the media who do good work. I still appear on CNN, MSNBC to do guest spots. But I do think there's a massive yawning gap, especially on Middle East stuff. And I think Zeteo helps to fill some of that gap.
So, Mehdi, on that point, can I just push you a little bit when you said, so those on the left you're saying who are essentially sort of going in or criticizing, you're saying they feel marginalized and then are you saying that they marginalize themselves because of the fact that they don't know how to navigate the mainstream? Is that what you mean? Or are there things that you, as an Oxford, for your own description, an Oxford sort of, highly educated, you could have been like Rishi Sunak kind of thing, in that sense, if that trajectory going, is it that you knew from the beginning that there were certain questions that you were not able or could not ask or there were certain ways of asking? Can you just explain a little bit what you mean by the tightrope?
Osama, it's a great question. And I think it's, first of all, to deal with the big picture. There are clearly structural issues with our media, both kind of the ownership and in terms of the what's the right word, culturalization, the process in which journalists go through to get to where they are. I'll always remember the famous Noam Chomsky interview that Andrew Marr did with Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you've seen the interview that the very famous British broadcaster Andrew Marr, the Tim Russert of the UK did with Noam Chomsky about 20 years ago. And he says to Chomsky, "Are you saying that I'm biased, that someone's telling me what to say?" And Chomsky says, no, I'm saying if you didn't say what you already said, you wouldn't be in that chair to begin with. And I think it's like, you're right. There are certain things that you do hold back from saying, undeniably so. Sometimes they're legitimate. Sometimes there's things you're willing to do. Sometimes there's things you might not want to do. You want to make a sacrifice over it. And it's not just Israel-Palestine. There are multiple issues on which in corporate media, people don't want you to say certain things. So there are structural and corporate and, actual barriers to saying what you want to say, clearly. But I'm saying separately to that, Osama, I am making a separate point, which is in addition to the structural barriers, there is a game that is played, and sometimes you need to know how to play that game. And sadly, some people on quote unquote our side of the argument either don't want to or don't know how to play that game. And look, each to their own. Right, I've reached the next point in my life. I'm in my 40s. I try not to be prescriptive. I'm not in my 20s. I told everyone what to do, say, think. Now I'm like, you know what? This is what I'm doing. If this is what you're doing, each to their own. But I do see some people saying, I do see people go on a CNN or an MSNBC, have a great platform, and just want to burn it all down rather than use that platform to maybe get their message across to the widest possible audience. It can be done. Look at Sunday night, just this Sunday night. My former colleague, Ayman Mohyeddin, had my other former colleague, Jeremy Scahill, on. And Jeremy's not often invited on cable news. I think the last person to invite him on MSNBC was me. And Jeremy was a masterclass from Jeremy, where he said what had to be said, but he said it in a way that's irrefutable.
Can you tell me, sorry, Mehdi, sorry to interrupt, but can you tell me what you mean by burning it down? Like, in other words, is it a tone? Are you talking about tone, or are you talking about accusations? Or are you talking about being too forthright, like on them? Just so for our viewers and listeners, what do you mean by burning it down?
I think it can be a mixture of things at different times. For example, picking the wrong battle at the wrong time. So, for example, I'm very critical of CNN. I think I just tweeted this morning and yesterday about CNN's. You've all seen this ridiculous piece that CNN have done about the poor soldier who killed lots of people and now he's sad. I'm very critical of CNN, but I'm also going to appear on CNN next week, right? Now, when I go on CNN next week, maybe I'll bring up that story if we're talking about Israel-Palestine. Maybe if we're not, I won't, right? I think you've got to pick and choose which battles you're doing. I think you also got to pick and choose what platforms you want to use, right? Because sometimes I feel like when I was a producer in TV, there were many times I would try and book a guest who I thought was a great voice who's not getting a shot on mainstream media. And that guest would say, well, these are my conditions. I won't appear with X. I won't appear with that host. I need to be able to say this. And it'd be like, well, that's not going to happen. So then you've got to decide, what are you willing to do to have that mainstream platform? Like, I live in the world as it is, not always as I want it to be. And I think too many people, especially on the left, sadly, want to have this, I don't know what the word, the utopia, where you'll only do things in the way you want at the time you want. And that's just not the way it works. So, yeah, I think it's a mixture of everything you said, Osama. Sorry, I don't have an exact case study right now, but I do worry that when we get these platforms and opportunities, sometimes we're just interested in the short-term high and not the long-term strategy.
But Jeremy, if I could just add to this conversation, one of the questions that comes up here. Sorry, Mehdi. Jeremy's on my mind, and now you see why. Sorry, but it actually it has to do exactly with, let's just say, the racial dynamics that kick in here, right? I mean, the whole point is Jeremy is not we all respect Jeremy. We've had him on the show, etc. But the point is Jeremy is not. He's not brown, right? He's not. Ayman is, obviously, right? So, but nevertheless, there's this sense that there are. Well, no. Let me ask you. Instead of saying it, let me ask you the question: are there not different rules that apply to people from brown, Muslim, Arab, to invent whatever catchphrase you want, right? So are we not given a tighter set of guidelines to operate in, so that perhaps Jeremy could get away with something that you or I might not be able to get away with, for example? Like what and then how aware are you of these racial contours that people from our
100%. I'm so aware of it. I wrote about it in a book that I published last year called Win Every Argument, The Art of Debating, Persuading, and Public Speaking. And I talk about in that book that from a very early age, from a very early period in my career, I recognized, and I was told, but I also recognized that I have what I call RAMF. I have resting angry Muslim face, which means when I'm paying attention to someone, when I'm doing an interview, when I'm listening intently, it looks like I'm furious. Looks like I'm about to kill you. My wife would often tell me, she's like, what are you doing? You look mad. I'm like, no, I'm paying attention. She goes, no, in that cutaway, you look mad. I remember when I first went on Sky News as a guest, having left as a producer, I went back as a guest. And a former colleague of mine, I won't take the name of an anchor, turned to me and said, you need to smile more. And at the time, I was really irritated. I said, you would never say that to a white guy. But at the end of the day, he was right? Both things are true. It is both a racial trope, but it's also true. It's like when Hillary Clinton was running or Kamala Harris is running now. There are horrible misogynistic and racist tropes that female black candidates have to deal with. Now, recognizing that those are racist tropes doesn't mean you can wish them away. You still have to navigate within the bounds of those tropes. And I think, again, there's too many people who say, well, to hell with that. I'll do whatever I want, no matter the consequences. I live in a consequences-based world. And I look at the consequences of all the actions. And I sometimes think, again, the short-term high of doing what you want to do, saying what you want to say, what does that result in if in long term I'm not getting the actions in this world or the outcomes that I want? So I'm trying as I get older and get grayer to think more strategically, to think in a more utilitarian way, to think in a consequences-based way. But no, of course, there are racial tropes. And I know that. And me and Ayman and Ali and others, there were no other anchors at MSNBC who were getting trolled on Twitter in October, November of last year as Hamas agents, as Hamas apologists. It was just the three Muslim guys. Joy and Chris also did segments sympathetic to Palestinians or coverage of, Israeli bomb attacks that we now see as war crimes. But they haven't been trolled in the same way. We know where that is. And I think, there's undeniably racism, misogyny, tropes, things that we can't say because of who we are. But again, what's our response to that? Is it to go sit in the corner and sulk and cry? Is it to moan and whine on WhatsApp groups? Is it to try and defy and then fail? Or is it to try and find a clever way of working around those tropes and around those barriers?
But Mehdi, also there's the flip side to this, of course, is that as somebody from, I say our, of course, as we said earlier, like you and the three of us we're not from the same background, but seen from a certain perspective, we all occupy the same kind of racial
In
position,
the
right?
racist side, we're all the
But the point is, yeah, of course, yeah. So, but the point is, there's also from our coming from our perspective, we've all three of us, we've never been tempted by this, but there are temptations also coming from our perspective to tell those in power exactly what they want to hear, and a gateway opens up. There are emoluments and rewards and all the rest of it. If you say what we want you to say, there are not plenty. There are, of course, some Arab intellectuals who've done this, who've instantly rise to fame despite their intellectual mediocrity. There are journalists from, let's say, our background, again, on major corporate media, who again play by a different set of rules, and find themselves with their own weekly talk shows, etc., etc. So have you felt those kinds of, I mean, I've never, it's never even crossed my mind, and maybe it's never even crossed your mind, but have you felt those, have you been aware of the flip side of all of these racist forms of suppression, and been aware of the kind of
not just, as you say, not just racist forms of suppression, but as you very well put, the doors that can open if you play the game completely as they want you to play it, if you say exactly what they want you to say. There are many times over my career in multiple media organizations, I don't have to name one, multiple, where I was told, don't tweet this, don't tweet that, don't say this, don't say that online. I ignored them, right? And I think my Twitter feed is evidence of that. And I think that has always been the case. And when people say to me, I've had people say to me, oh, when I was at NBC in particular, there were people say, oh, I used to love you when you were at The Intercept. I used to love you when you were now you're a corporate sellout. And I would say two things. Number one, what views of mine did I have at The Intercept and Al Jazeera that I no longer hold today or no longer express at MSNBC? Number one, can you tell me that? Number two, if I wanted to sell out, my career would look very different right now. Like, there are very easy ways to sell out in the US media, right? There are very easy ways to get book deals and corporate jobs, which a lot of people and a lot of us will never do. And look, as I say, my career could have gone a very, very different way. I could have turned up as Rishi Sunak, to quote someone earlier in the show. No, I chose to go this way. Did I go the exact way that some on the left would want? No. But as I say, we've all done different journeys. And for me, again, it is ultimately about impact and consequences, right? I could do whatever even Zeteo, right? Zeteo is my own company. I'm able to do what I want. I've got no one to worry about above me. But if I get to a point where I think Zeteo is having no impact, it's not actually changing hearts and minds, it's not actually growing and having influence on the mainstream, on the people in power, then I may have to wrap it all up, because I'm not here for an ego trip.
So, Mehdi, could I ask you a follow up on that? How do you measure impact? What is one obvious question and one obvious rejoinder. But also, if I were to push back, of course, from a friendly position, I mean, an allied position, but saying when you describe, you're saying that you live in a consequences based, I can't remember the phrase you use, consequences based order or world. I mean, presumably I understand what you're saying. In other words, there's realpolitik, there are actual sort of boundaries. There are, in the end, you want to have as one American politician or diplomat once told me, you can spend your time lecturing to 5 students, or you can talk to the people in power. That was his way of telling me, like, basically, you can lecture all you want about the history of Palestine, the history of the Middle East, but in the end, if you want to be heard, you have to play by the rules of the game. It's as simple as that. No ifs or buts. But the question is, how do you measure impact? And don't you feel that at some level there's been a huge shift in social media, in the fact that there are many people on the ground, young people, students, not just students, but young people in Gaza, young people in the West Bank, young people in Lebanon, who are picking up their phones and being, in a sense, journalists in their own way, that sort of bypasses this entire question of having to play by the rules of the game. So I'm just trying to, is there a way that you could say a little bit?
These are great questions, and I like both the questions you just asked. Let's deal with them in order. Number one, on the impact. Number one, on the young people and bypassing. Yeah, of course. I mean, without social media, we wouldn't be able to see the genocide that was happening in Gaza right now, without the brave Palestinians on the ground live streaming the stuff. It has been a game changer, right? The old gatekeepers don't have the power they had. And in many ways, not always, but in many ways, that's a good thing, right? I straddle multiple worlds, so I see the benefits of it on Gaza. I see the disbenefits of it when it comes to Trump and MAGA, an entire community of Americans who've cut themselves off from a reality-based universe and live in a fantasy land without any gatekeepers. So if you say Gaza, there are no gatekeepers, I say, yay. When you say US politics, there are no gatekeepers, I say, what a tragedy. We now have a bunch of freaks who think, FEMA's coming to take your house and they'd rather die in a hurricane than trust the mainstream media. So I think we got to see it in multiple ways when we talk about the lack of gatekeepers. And look, they are bypassing the gatekeepers, but at the end of the day, to what extent, right? At the end of the day, are we getting all the information out of Gaza thanks to social media? Yes, we are. Is that changing policy on the ground, in Washington or London or Toronto or Paris, Ottawa or Paris? Not really, as I think we're all despairing, right? So it only goes so far. And again, I'll go back to what I said at the start of the show. I believe in insider and outsider political pressure. I believe in insider and outsider media strategies. I don't believe it's one or the other. I am greedy. To go back to your point and the person who said to you, speak to 5 people or speak to the people, my response to that is say, no, I'd rather do both. I'd like to do both. I'd like to speak to the 5 people and speak my mind, but I also like to be able to speak to the people in power, right? Because if I'm only doing one or the other, then A, I'm not true to myself, and B, I'm not having the impact that I want. And I don't quite know how you measure impact. Maybe it's like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. You know it when you see it, right? I know when we have influenced a member of Congress. I know when a presidential campaign is paying attention. I know when a parliamentarian is watching our stuff. I know when a human rights group is reaching out to us and saying, thank you for that piece of journalism. I know when people in Gaza are messaging saying, thank you for elevating our voices, right? I can feel and see it. We just did a story last night. Prem Thakur, our political correspondent, just broke the story of DOJ lawyers who have written to Merrick Garland internally saying, why are you not prosecuting Israel for killing Americans? Why are you going against your own department's guidelines and principles, right? That, for me, tells us we're having an impact. The Department of Justice lawyers want to come to Zeteo to share a big story, not necessarily CNN or the New York Times. It's hard to measure. I get it. But I do want to be able to have that impact, both quote unquote, on the masses, on the people, on the students, on the youth, but also on the people of power. Because if I'm not having an impact on the people of power, then really what are we doing, right? Are we not just indulging our, I don't want to say egos, but our best of intentions, our noble motives, but no real world impact? I think none of us want to have no real world impact. I mean, I'll just give you an example. I've come on your show now. Why have I come on your show? You're not people in power, right? You're not CNN. Why am I here? I'm here because A, I respect you guys. I like you guys. I want to have this conversation. B, I want to talk to your audience, who's an audience I value, whether they are people in power or not. And C, I think the discussion itself, when people watch it later, will be of value, I hope, to people, right? Those are the reasons I come on the show. Why did Kareem come on my show, right? Kareem came on my show, I hope, not just to waste time while he was sitting in France, but because he thought by speaking to Mehdi, my message will get out there. People will hear a different analysis of what's happening in Lebanon. So I think we all kind of measure up what we're doing with our time, what impact we're having, what platforms we're using. And the debate we're really having, if this is even a debate, is, well, what are the right platforms? What are we willing to do on those platforms? And as I say, that becomes an individual choice. There's no prescription here.
Mehdi, I want to ask you, I want to transition towards Gaza and Lebanon and the coverage there. But before that, I'm wondering, as you were saying this, I'm thinking, the fact that you were asked to come onto mainstream media in the first place. Why is it that they asked you to come? And how is it that you're able to start your own company? So clearly there's an audience that is now growing. And I think Sadi mentioned, especially the younger ones, who are looking for alternatives, right? I mean, you must feel that, in the sense of discussing about impact, that must be something.
Oh, 100%. Look, I wouldn't have started this company if I didn't think there was an audience and an impact. I thought long and hard. It was a bit of as my wife says to me often, like, you can't run anything. How the hell are you running a company? Like, people said to me, what are you doing? You're a journalist. You're not a businessman. You're not a very organized person. I've never even really been freelance in my entire career. I've been like 25 years of like W2, warmly ensconced in the bosom of establishment media. The idea of running my own thing was a big deal. I would never have done it if I didn't firmly believe there was an audience for it. And in the 8 months we've been in existence, there clearly is an audience for it. We now have nearly 300,000 subscribers globally, and we're doing very well financially in terms of paid subscribers, although we could always do it more, so shameless plug, Zeteo.com. But to come back to your point about why, I remember being at Al Jazeera English as a full-time employee anchor in 2016, 17, and people would say to me when the Eric Prince stuff went viral, and some of my other interviews went viral, people said, oh, it's only a matter of time till CNN or MSNBC hire you. And I would say, don't be silly. They're never going to hire someone like me. A, with my politics, B, with my interviewing style, right? It just doesn't, neither of those things fit in US mainstream media. But Phil Griffin and NBC did come to me in the summer of 2020 and say, hey, we're launching the streaming channel. Do you want a show? We could also maybe give you a show on the weekend on the cable channel. And that was an offer that was too good to turn down. That's why, I was loving my time at The Intercept. I was loving doing Al Jazeera shows. But I thought, again, to come back to the why would I turn down a chance to speak to a mainstream liberal American audience and try and get some other ideas into that discourse, which I think I was pretty successful in doing over 3 years. If I take nothing else with me to my grave, it'll be the email that Noam Chomsky sent me a few years ago and said, Mehdi, in 25 years of NBC's existence, no one has ever invited me on MSNBC until you did. I had Chomsky on, I think, 2 or 3 times. For me, that was like, great. We got guests on that other people didn't have. When Israel was being bombed in 2021, we got Palestinian voices on that no one else had. I grilled the Israeli spokesman in a way that other NBC anchors didn't. So I can't answer the question, Karim, of why they came and hired me, other than without sounding like an egomaniac and saying maybe they just saw some talent and thought he's good at what he does. We'll soften out the political stuff later, or we'll ignore the political stuff. I don't know. I can't speak for other people. But they came and offered me a job. I took it. I think I did well for 3.5 years. I had a huge impact there in terms of our numbers. Our social media clips beat all the primetime shows. I did sit in for Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow and the rest of the primetime gang. But I didn't change my politics. I'll tell you this. The week of the Afghan withdrawal, remember August 2021, I happened to be subbing for Chris Hayes on primetime, Monday to Friday, the week when Kabul fell. And I remember the mainstream media coverage, it was all hawkish crap, generals saying we can't end it, this is bad, this is good for terrorism, Biden's weak, all the usual pro-war tropes in DC. I was sitting on primetime with Afghan guests on air, talking about how they had suffered, what this meant to them, putting the case for ending an American war on primetime. MSNBC let me do it, and I took the opportunity to do it. And I will look back on that and say, that was worth doing. Now, what were they thinking at the time? You'd have to ask them.
Okay, Mehdi, I want to shift to the discussion about Gaza. And I have a couple of questions, which, and I'm sure my brothers will jump in on this. The first is, just generally speaking, you mentioned Jeremy and a few of the others, you, Ayman, others. But on the whole, the way in which Gaza has been covered, in particular by the Western press, and in particular with so many Palestinian journalists that have been killed, with, as far as I know, and please correct me, with almost no solidarity. Again, some good individuals, but sort of as a whole, it's as though they don't exist, that they're not really journalists, that they're brown, even browner. They're brown, they're on the ground type brown, which don't count, or they're stringers, or this kind of thing. How does that play out within the journalistic world, or does this not come up at all? And then the second question is, it kind of relates a little bit more to the substance. The question of October 7th. And it's not so much about, does one condemn, doesn't one condemn, but does one have to condemn it? You, me, anybody who gets on any of these shows, in order to enter the conversation. So you have to kind of start already with the way in which these guys need you to start before you gain any legitimacy to be able to continue what you have to say. So how does that work, and how does that pressure on you, on everyone, basically work?
So great questions. So let me just deal with the first one. The lack of solidarity, the lack of even sometimes awareness of what is happening with Palestinian journalists on the ground in Gaza is one of the most shocking things I've seen in my life and my career as a journalist on either side of the Atlantic. It has been pretty disgusting, actually, to see people I like, who I worked with, admire, friends of mine, just completely drop the ball on this, just completely be morally blind to what's happening. And I don't know what's worse. Is it that they know and don't care? Or is it that they know they care, but they don't have the guts to say anything? I'm not sure what's worse, to be honest. But whether it's kind of callousness or cowardice, I think history will judge the journalists of our era when it comes to the Gaza war. And I think that it has been tragic to see the failure. You saw the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where there was no solidarity expressed, passing reference. We did a video at Zeteo when we launched the company around the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where we read out the names and quotes from certain journalists just to try and give them some humanity, because that's the fundamental problem with all of the coverage of Palestine. Like, put aside all the history, politics, but fundamentally it comes down to these people are not considered human, right? There is a dehumanization of Palestinians, including Palestinian journalists who are not, as you say, considered real journalists too. And I think fundamentally it's shameful. Liberal media, if you ask me to list, the crimes of liberal media, that would be very near the top in my lifetime. The way in which they just erase. Look right now, like there's an Al Jazeera cameraman shot in the neck, in a coma, needs help. Nothing from all the anchors who jumped up and down about American journalists detained in Moscow, American journalists detained in Syria. Not a word about Palestinian journalists, or not even just Palestinian journalists, an American journalist in the West Bank shot and killed by the Israeli military, Shireen Abu Akleh. The lack of solidarity, the lack of awareness, shameful. And it's really made me change my view of a lot of people. I've called October 7th a masks off moment. We saw the real side of a lot of people. It's been very depressing, actually. And just to go to October 7th itself, you're right. To enter into the conversation, you are expected in liberal circles, both political and media, to first make it about October 7th. You saw Kamala Harris ridiculously asked about the suffering in Gaza just a day ago. And she started talking about it and then reset, immediately went back to talking points. But the biggest and first tragedy, the worst thing, was October 7th. She's unable to talk about Palestinian or Lebanese suffering without the reference point being October 7th. It has become 9/11 on steroids in many ways. If you remember, I spent years debating terrorism and radicalization in the UK, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and it was always, but what about 9/11? Are you justifying 9/11? Are you an apologist for Al-Qaeda? It's the same thing again, but on steroids. But here's one thing, let me add a caveat when you talk about the media discussions. I do Piers Morgan's show, and the running meme about Piers Morgan is always, will you condemn Hamas? And you have to be ready for that stuff. But for me, I will just say one thing, and I don't know whether you agree or disagree. It is both frustrating and annoying to have to do the caveat of, well, first we condemn what happened on October 7th before you can condemn what Israel's doing in Gaza. But having said that, I happen to think what happened on October 7th in many ways was a moral catastrophe, were war crimes. So it's not like I'm being fake or disingenuous and going through the motions of, all right, let me fake condemn October 7th and then I can talk about Gaza. No, I actually think October 7th was horrible, so I'm happy to condemn it. What annoys me is people expecting me to condemn it, people telling me that I have to do so in order to have permission to speak about Gaza, people telling me that it's worse than Gaza when, 33 times as many people have been killed in Gaza as were killed on October 7th. That again comes back to what I just said. Only one side is humanized. You saw that the other day when 4 Israeli soldiers were killed in a base by a Hezbollah attack, and Sky News read out their names and ages on air and then said, and 20 people were killed in Lebanon. No names, no ages, no faces, no humanity. And again, time and again, I come back to what is my mission in humanity.
Mehdi, but just to come back to this question of it's the language of condemnation that's interesting, right? Because we've all written, the three of us have written about this, and we had Ta-Nehisi Coates on recently to talk about it. You've probably seen some of his other interviews too, right? So there are ways to talk about October 7th in human terms without using the language of condemnation. In other words, my impulse, first of all, like when I wrote about it a year ago, more or less a year ago for N+1, was to say, let's put this in context. Once you put it in a colonial context, there's actually nothing particularly unusual or surprising about October 7th. There are examples of versions of October 7th going back to the so-called Indian Mutiny in 1857, or Haiti, or the Algerian Revolution, or Nat Turner, which is the one Ta-Nehisi talks about. There are millions of examples of incidents just like this from colonial history. So the question is, the language specifically of condemnation. It is that Piers Morgan sort of knee-jerk, will you, as opposed to understanding, contextualizing, historicism.
And also,
because one can do.
Said, if I could just add,
to be either or.
It's also the idea of, it's like the condemnation of suicide bombings in a previous era. In other words, it wasn't about violence and it wasn't about killing of civilians that people were outraged in the West and the liberal West. It was about a specific form that they don't happen to practice because that's not their condition. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, that it's never been about violence. It's never about killing innocent civilians, because obviously if it's about innocent civilians, it's about horror, it's about shock or context. But if it's about killing all these things, they would have gone back decades.
It's about killing particular people, Osama. It's about killing particular people.
Let me say a couple of things. Number one, sorry, it's interesting that you mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, because you were the one earlier in the discussion who said Jeremy Scahill is a white guy, so he can get away with it. I would say the same thing. Ta-Nehisi Coates can get away with stuff the four of us cannot get away with, right? So I think it's slightly different. That's why it's been so interesting to see his media tour, because he is saying stuff that people are cheering on that I probably couldn't say or get away with saying. So he's Ta-Nehisi Coates. A, his biography is Ta-Nehisi Coates' biography. B, he's a Black American Christian, not a brown Muslim immigrant. So that's one point. Number two, I agree with you that the kind of insistence on condemnation is a problem, right? Like, I've talked about the condemnathons that are expected of us for years. I spent 3 years at MSNBC mocking white Christian conservatives every time there was some domestic terror attack or insurrection, saying, have your leaders come forward to condemn it? Where were they radicalized? Like, I've done that game to make that point of the hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to expecting us to condemn terrorism when Israelis never condemn terrorism, Christians never condemn white nationalist terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. We all know this stuff, right? But then here's where I might slightly differ with you. I can understand the colonial context and still think it's wrong, right? And I think I agree with you. It's all about context. The reason I set up Zeteo is context. My journalism after October 7th on MSNBC was about context. And people attack me for, if you talk about context, well, then you're justifying terrorism, blah, blah, blah. But having said all that, I can still, two things. Morally, I can still say what I think they did was wrong, whether it was expected, unsurprising, the reaction to people being besieged. I can take the quote unquote Ehud Barak line and say, well, if I was born a Palestinian, would I have done the same? Ta-Nehisi Coates said the line the other day on Trevor Noah's podcast, right? And he immediately attacked. He says he would have done October 7th. No, he's making the point that Ehud Barak has made, that Ami Ayalon made on this show, in this studio with me, which is, if you were born in those circumstances, you would resort to violence too. That's most people would. That is the history that you just laid out, sorry. That doesn't change the fact, though, that if I'm on air talking about the crimes committed in Gaza, then for me to be morally consistent, I have no problem condemning the crimes committed on October 7th. I have one principle, which is you don't intentionally kill civilians. Therefore, I have no problem with that. My problem is people expecting me to do it, the racist trope that is involved with a white media interview or a white politician saying, well, have you condemned Hamas? That I have a problem with, of course. But do I have any issue volunteering my objections to what Hamas did on October 7th? No, I don't.
No, Mehdi, if I could just interrupt and just ask you, it's not, obviously all of us are sort of ethically bound, and all of us, of course, are horrified by violence of any sort in that sense. But having said all that, isn't there a difference in your view when you're trying to get this across to a liberal mainstream audience, or even yourself? You're saying forget the liberal mainstream because you're saying this is coming out of deep conviction, the abhorrence of of violence. The question is there a way of actually educating a liberal mainstream white audience, as you put it, or as you intimated, that there's a difference fundamentally between the violence of the colonizers and the violence of the colonized? Is there no difference? In other words, if we're just talking about, you see what I'm saying? This is the question.
That's the problem, because Mehdi, that becomes the problem if it's just condemning attacks on civilians. But then there's, as Osama was saying, there's a kind of leveling. It's not. That's why the context is so important, right?
You and Osama put the question. Let me ask Osama. I can agree that anti-colonial violence is not the same thing as colonial violence. I can agree that people under occupation have a right to armed resistance, which I've said multiple times. But of course, there are rules to it, right? My problem is there's a lot of people on social media these days who think you can do whatever you want. I don't agree with that, right? By any means necessary, it's a great rhetorical line. It's illegal under international law. There are actually limits to what you can do, even as a resistance fighter. I think we can all agree on that. But my question to you about the context then is, are we then suggesting, and I'm not saying you are, but I just want to clarify, that the violence on October 7th is somehow, I'm trying to find the right word, better, more worthy? Like, if we're putting an anti-colonial framework, like Nat Turner's rebellion is a good example, and Ta-Nehisi used that as an example. He said, would I have, how do I react to Nat Turner's rebellion? Would I have joined it? None of us know what we would have done in that situation as slaves trying to free expression. But looking back from today with the moral framework that I operate in, clearly what Nat Turner did was wrong, right? Clearly, killing innocent white people was wrong.
But you can't, correct, absolutely, but you can't condemn, it's hard to condemn Nat Turner's violence or slave rebellion without condemning slavery, correct?
I agree, 100%. We're in agreement. I agree with that. And that's why I'm quoting Ehud Barak. So you asked me, how do I react to a white audience? That's what I tell white audiences. I say, even Israelis, hawkish Israelis say that if they were born under occupied territories and treated by the way Israel treats them, they would react to violence. That is what I say. That is why when Ami Ayalon, I did the interview with Ami Ayalon, former head of Shin Bet, and he said, I wouldn't have joined Hamas, but I would definitely fight the Israelis. We clipped that up and put that out, because I think people need to hear the former head of Shin Bet saying, people under occupation, denied freedom, not only have a right to fight back, but everyone would do it in that position, or almost everyone would probably do the same in that position. So I'm all for putting it in context. But just to come back to October 7th, something I wrote in my book about, you mentioned persuading an audience, and that is what I try and do. Something I said in my book, I have a chapter in the book on judo moves, rhetorical techniques to try and get people on board. And one of them is concessions, right? You know this from the art. The Greeks, ancient Greeks taught us this centuries ago, right? You concede a point here to make a point there. And I think sometimes, again, to go back to what we talked about at the beginning, when we're on this journey of ours, some of us don't want to do that. I'm happy to make concessions here and there. I'm happy to say, all right, if the price of admission for me to be able to say my piece to millions of people on Gaza is to condemn something I think is wrong anyways, then I'll do it. I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy that we live in a racist world where Israeli lives are prioritized over Palestinian lives, but I'm happy to make that concession. Also, don't forget, I don't care about the people in power. I care about the people at home watching. That's my audience. And in their heads, unfortunately, they're at a position where they don't understand what you just laid out. And in order to get them there, you need some kind of entry fee, which says, I'll condemn October 7th, even though October 7th, as you say, in the history of things, is something among, Israelis did similar things to October 7th to create Israel. We know about Tantura. We know about the people that were raped and killed in 1948, which no one talks about. But in order to even get to that.
Whoa, Mehdi, hang on. I wouldn't compare what Israel did to what happened on October 7th, though. I mean, in 1948. There's a difference between establishing a settler. No, but it's one is in a project of liberation. The other one is in the project to establish a settler colonial
goals and intent different, means same. I'm talking about means.
So, Mehdi, just on this point, Karim, I know Karim has some questions about some other topics because we're running out of time. But very quickly, on this point, you keep referring to, and it's interesting. It reminds me of what you said earlier in the show about the things that you have to do or certain ways of speaking and talking to actually reach an audience. So when you refer to Ehud Barak or you refer to Ami Ayalon, I don't remember who else you referred to just now, those two people. Oftentimes, and I know this also in history, sort of my profession, history, sort of oftentimes we'll have to cite Israeli historians to make the point of X. Does that not actually end up sort of undermining the very points you're trying to make, which is to establish the credibility and legitimacy of an objective viewpoint, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Arab, whether it's whatever, but we always end up looking to these Israeli figures to say, look, they're saying this, therefore my space is, do you see what I'm saying? My space is opened up by having, because often I've heard this so many times, people always, or they'll talk about Haaretz, what a great newspaper it is, blah, 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 etc.
I agree with you. I agree with you in the principle. And I do this a lot, by the way. I often say, if you watch my show, you'll often see, and my producers make fun of me because they see it in script. I'll often say, don't take my word for it, take his. And I'll quote someone like, I'll quote a Republican on Trump, or I'll quote, and it is a rhetorical technique. It is a way of getting through to people who you might not be able to get to. Does it have costs? Yes. And you just laid out one of the costs, which is you are kind of reasserting the primacy and dominance and credibility of those people. No doubt about it. But I would throw it back to you and say, what's the alternative? In that moment, if you're sitting on a live panel on CNN and you have 30 seconds to make the point, do I quote Ehud Barak, or do I try and do an exposition on all of the Palestinian historians who have, you take my point, right? In the positions I'm in, maybe not the same ones you're in, this is a shortcut that makes the point that I want to make. And does it have costs? Yes. But again, is it either or? I think you can do that while also building up Palestinian narrative scholarship. Like I do a show where we have on Palestinian guests. I was at MSNBC. I had Noura Erakat on when other people didn't have Noura Erakat on. It's not like I didn't also elevate Palestinian scholars, Arab scholars, Muslim historians, credible people. Again, is it either or? I just worried about the binary. I 100% agree with your point, Osama. I just think, can you try and do both? Maybe. I'm greedy, as you've noticed by now.
Yes, well, so the question, obviously, I've seen several of your recent videos on your, on Twitter and your show, and the question, of course, just to come straight at it, I mean, the question of who should Arabs and Muslims, etc., but Arabs in particular, as far as we're concerned, in Michigan and other parts like this, the question of voting, you got this thing, you're either voting for somebody who's full on genocide, and full on invasion of Lebanon, and on the other hand, some kind of crazy guy that could be worse or not when it comes to the Middle East. I'm not talking about domestically. I don't think there's much doubt about that. The guy is going to be insane when it comes to Muslims, when it comes to Arabs, when it comes to society as a whole. I think. I mean, at least that's my opinion. But when it comes to the Middle East itself, I mean, you're being put in the situation where I just saw there was a recent poll that shows that the kind of approval for Kamala Harris on housing, and then at the very, very, very bottom of it, there's this thing of Middle East. How would you handle the Middle East? And she's like way, way at the bottom of this. And my question to you is, how does one try to understand? On the one hand, they say Trump is an existential threat to America, to the world for that matter. And on the other hand, they won't do this minimal stuff of changing the rhetoric, forget even the policy, the rhetoric, humanizing a little bit. How do you explain that?
I can't explain it. I've been saying this for a year. I went on CNN the night of the Flower Massacre, and I made exactly that point that you said. I said, isn't it insane that Joe Biden says Donald Trump is an existential threat to American democracy, and yet he's willing to throw away American democracy for Benjamin Netanyahu? It doesn't make sense. There are only two options. Number one, that they don't believe he's an existential threat to democracy, even though I happen to believe he is. Or number two, they actually do care about Israel more than they care about the United States, the Joe Bidens of this world. It is insane. I mean, I did a video. You said you watched my video. I did a video last week addressing the vice president, saying, if you lose Michigan, this is on you. You cannot blame anyone but yourself, because you've been warned, you've been told. It's not like you wake up and go, wow, we didn't know how much discontent there was. You've been heckled. You've had opinion polls. You've met with uncommitted movement. Well, you didn't meet with uncommitted movement leaders. They tried to talk to you. Like, there's no debate about the fact that they could be up 2-3 points in Michigan if they changed their rhetoric, as you say, forget policy. So it kills me that we are on course for a Trump presidency because the Democrats couldn't stand up to or decided to happily back Benjamin Netanyahu.
Do you have insight as to why? I mean, is it just you're giving? I mean, do you not talk to something like even off the record? I mean, do you?
Yeah. So I'll tell you what people have told me off the record. Democrats in the DNC and elsewhere. The only insight I have into the electoral strategy is they think that they can still win even if Arabs and Muslims don't vote for them in Michigan. They think that white women in the suburbs, college educated, upset about abortion will get them across the line. They think that auto workers and labor, who are very happy with Biden's very good record on labor versus Trump's, will get them across the line. We shall see. They may be right. They may be wrong. We shall see what happens. A, does she lose Michigan? B, if she loses Michigan, can she still pick up other states and still win? Much harder. It's killing me that I'm stuck here in the middle getting attacked from all sides, because when I say stuff to Harris, like what I just said, Democrats say, but don't you know Trump is worse? I do know he's worse. And when I tell Arabs and Muslims Trump is worse, they say, well, you're a shill for Harris. So I'm stuck in this horrible position where I want this damn election to be over. Just to go back to your earlier point, though, about, on the one hand, we have full-on genocide, full-on invasion. And then you said, but on the other side, a crazy guy. No, on the other side, you have full-on genocide and full-on invasion. Have you checked out the Republican Party recently? I mean, Speaker Mike Johnson is a Christian evangelical who is more pro-Israeli than even the last speaker or the speaker before that. I don't think there's any debate that the Republican Party en masse is in favor of genocide, actually hates Palestinians. And something I say to Muslim crowds whenever I speak is, how many members of Congress have called for a ceasefire? About 75, 80? How many have called for arms conditions? Anywhere between 40 and 50, depending on which bill you look at. How many of them are Republicans? 0. Right? That tells you everything about the Republican Party.
Yeah, Mehdi, there's no question. There's no question that they are. I mean, the Republican Party, I mean, they seem to be insane and on all kinds of issues, not just this issue. But the big difference at the end of the day between presidential candidates, first of all, there's two things. One is, we've talked about this separately before. One is, when you vote for Kamala Harris, you are endorsing, willy-nilly, you are endorsing the genocide for which she stands and which she is backed up to the hilt without any reservation, without
I don't agree with that.
right?
I think you're wrong.
Okay, well, let's come back to that. The second thing is that the big we could all agree where she is infinitely worse than him is on foreign policy.
No, I don't agree
right?
with you.
Whereas
I
at least
agree with
as
that
it
either.
stands.
I think
as
you're
it
wrong on
stands.
both. It's a fact.
So you think?
I think he's
that
100% wrong
Okay.
in foreign policy
Go ahead.
because simple reason is the man is unhinged racist. So he's by definition worse on every issue without even needing to look at the issue. As Kareem said, it's not just domestic policy, which Kareem acknowledged, it's every policy. I'm also kind of tired of the whitewashing of the Trump record. I'm not saying you're doing this, sorry, but in general, Americans are like goldfish. They have the memory of like 2 minutes ago, and we've just kind of memory hold the Trump presidency.
No, I don't. He's a psychopath.
But
There's
I'm
no
not
question.
sure how
That's
you
not-
could
that's
say
not
she's
the question.
undeniably worse than foreign policy. He's the guy who killed Qasem Soleimani and tried to start World War III with Iran. He's the guy.
She has a record. She has an established, actual
So does he, as
material
president.
record of
She has a
supporting
record.
women
Hold
for
on.
genocide.
She has a record as a senator and as a vice president, no power. He has a record as a president, in which he killed more people in Syria, Iraq, Somalia. He dropped the biggest bomb in America's arsenal on Afghanistan. He tried to start a war with Iran by assassinating Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil. This is a guy who tore up the Iran nuclear deal. This is a guy who, jeopardized nuclear war with Kim Jong-un, right? We literally had U.S. Department of Homeland Security officials.
But Mehdi, so if I can push back a little bit.
That's a different argument. Sorry, hold on. That's a different argument. One second, Osama. Let me finish with Sari and I'll come to you. That is a different argument. Why should we deal with either of them is a different argument. I'm dealing with the argument that she is somehow worse or the same as him. In my view, he is worse. Not just him, by the way. We talk about Trump as if he's a president on his own. We know that Jared Kushner and David Friedman and Miriam Adelson will be running Palestine policy. We know that the West Bank could be next for genocide because that's what Adelson wants, right? So this idea that people say, well, it can't get any worse. Actually, it can. Of course it can get worse. Things can always get worse. So I don't accept that she is somehow worse than him. I think they're both bad on the Middle East, and I think he's unhinged and surrounded by Christian evangelical nutcases. Coming back to your first question, no, I don't think...
and Jewish nutcases.
There were two questions.
The
First point, no, I don't believe if you're voting for Harris, you're endorsing the genocide. That's absurd. I vote for politicians all the time, and I don't agree with everything they say. The idea that when you vote for a politician, you agree with everything they say is insane. Millions of Muslims, conservative Muslims, are going to vote, well, not millions, thousands of conservative Muslims are going to vote for Jill Stein because they want to stop genocide. They won't be voting for Jill Stein because they support her transgender policies. So this idea that if you vote for a politician, you agree with everything they say is just insane, right? The only person I would vote for to endorse everything they say is myself.
Hang on.
And I'm not running for any.
Okay, no, not everything. It's not everything. But genocide in human history, genocide tends to be in a category by itself. For whatever reason, right or wrong.
I agree. And if the alternative was non-genocidal, then we would have a discussion. She's not running in a vacuum, sorry. The other guy is more genocidal. So I have to weigh that up when I look at the choices.
On this point, without it's not, we're not here to interrogate as such, but there is this question of, I think it's important ultimately to there is an acknowledgement, there is a genocide happening right now. And as far as I can tell, no people have ever been asked to vote for the people who are actually actively committing genocide against them. And there is no question that the Biden-Harris administration has been carrying out genocide, has been enabling this genocide, has, as you've said on the show, you've said on your shows a million times. Okay, so to ask people to go vote for the people who are obliterating...
I haven't done that, by the way.
What do you mean you haven't done that?
I have never asked people to go vote for Kamala Harris, just to be clear.
No, in other words, I'm saying to be aware of what's going on and to be aware of, the issue is not voting for Trump. The issue is, there's no question that I'm sure none of us are voting for Trump, that's for sure. Precisely because he is an unhinged, he is dangerous, and the Republican Party around him are absolutely vicious. They're not just insane, they're just racist. Pure racist, anti-intellectual. They're a danger to everything. So I get that. But the real issue is you're asking, or not you're asking, but one is asking by saying it's either this or that. In the end, no people in any democratic society, as far as I'm aware, have ever been asked to vote for people who are committing and obliterating their own people. So I think that has to be put into the equation. It's not simply there's.
Hold on, Osama. Let me jump in here. Who's not putting in the equation? I literally did a video last week saying exactly what you said, that you can't expect people to do this when they've asked you to do one thing, which is stop the genocide, which is in your power. I wrote a piece for The Guardian saying American president...
Fair enough, but what I'm saying, I'm not disputing that you didn't... Yeah, good, I'm glad. But what I'm saying is that in democratic politics, since we're talking about in democratic politics, never have people been asked, never has an electorate been asked to vote for. Like, do you see what I'm saying? That's never happened before.
But if we're going to play that game about never before have you had a candidate who says, elect me and you never have to vote again. I'll be a dictator just for a day.
Nobody's voting. I'm not voting for Trump. It's not about voting for Trump.
No, come on, Osama. This is Osama. Sorry. Let's just be clear. The fact that none of you are voting for Trump is irrelevant. On January 20th, 2025, one of two people will be president, Donald J. Trump or Kamala Harris. Let me turn it back to three of you. Who would you rather that person be? To go back to the beginning of the show, that's all that matters. Consequences, impact, real world, not hypotheticals, not abstract. Who should be the president? If you say Trump,
one way to answer that.
Before you answer, if you say Trump because Kamala needs to be punished, I respect that and I totally understand that. But let's be honest about what the consequence of not voting for Kamala Harris is. You say, Osama, never in history has people been asked to vote for people who are doing a genocide. I don't disagree, but I add to that, which is I also want to stop a genocide. The world does not end on January 20th. On January 20th, we will wake up and we'll have a new president. And some of us, I assume you three as well, will want to carry on fighting for Palestinian rights and against genocide. My view is it will be harder to do that. under Donald Trump. You may disagree.
Mehdi, the problem is that for you, I don't know how long you've been in the U.S. You said 2015 or something like that. We've been here longer than that. Our choice as Arab Americans has consistently, it's not the first time, by the way, we're asked as Arab Americans to vote for somebody who's racistly inclined against our people or, where we come from, et cetera, right? We've been doing this where we've been put in this position for literally, in my case, decades, right? The point is, as Arab Americans, or as Americans in general, not just Arab Americans, voting for Democrats has always been, yeah, they're evil, but they're the lesser of two evils. The other one is even more evil, right? Every single time we do that, we get wars, we get invasions, we get genocides, we get Obama and the drone wars, we get Afghanistan, we get the
And what
invasion of
happens
Iraq,
when you
we get the
don't do that?
destruction of
Hold
Libya.
on. What happens when you... No. You said I've only been here 9 years.
That's not the point.
I was
The point
visiting
is,
America in 98, 99, 2000. What happened when you didn't vote for Democrats?
Mehdi, the point is,
Bush
if we want
and
the
the Iraq
system to
invasion.
change,
Sorry, no, hold on.
we can't just
erase
focus.
a bit of history. You just said Obama and drone strikes. 80% of Muslims voted for Bush in 2000, thinking Joe Lieberman and Al Gore were Zionists who were worse. How did that work out for 1 million dead Iraqis and Afghans?
No, that's not a, you don't know. I mean, that's, of course, that's a complete hypothetical question, because we don't know what would have happened had 9/11 occurred under Gore, Lieberman. Do you see what I mean, we have no idea what would have happened. We don't know what would happen. I think
Al Gore would have invaded Afghanistan. I don't think he would have done the Iraq War.
We don't know. But
but Mehdi, you can't deny that Democrats have had their fair share, including in Yemen.
Who's defending the Democrats?
Right? I mean,
the issue is not whether we defend them or not. The issue is, and none of you
it's
have
the
answered my
lesser of two
question. I'll ask it again. On January 20th, 2025, there will be a new president. Who would you rather support Palestinian rights under? President Harris or President Trump? I know it's not President Trump.
It's not a question of this presidency. It's a question of building an actual alternative in the U.S. If we keep voting for the lesser of two evils, we're just going to end up with evil. That's all.
You're evading the question. On January 20th, Sari Maktisi,
no,
who would you rather be fighting for?
It's not about. It doesn't
matter. You can't
matter.
just wish it away. This is what I'm saying.
Matter.
This is the beauty of being academic. You can wish it away. I have to live in the real world. I'm going to be sitting in the studio.
I don't wish it away. I don't wish it away.
What freedoms I have as a journalist
I think they're
to speak out on this issue.
It's a competition.
Who's going to be deporting me or not?
It's a competition between two malicious people. Ultimately.
Can I ask you, Mehdi? Can I just ask you, because I know at the time, at this point, regardless of who wins or who one votes for, do the Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, will they have any leverage? No matter who wins. If the Democrats win, they'll say, "You see, we won without you," or whatever. And if Trump wins, he's going to say whatever. So do they have any leverage? Will anybody end up with leverage?
So I've worried about that for a while, that you have this strategy whereby you say, well, we're going to deny Harris a victory. And if you deny Harris a victory, you get Trump, so you don't have any leverage. And if you fail to deny her the victory, they do exactly what you just said, which is, well, we won without you, screw you. So I do worry about that. I don't think there's a good answer to that question. I think Muslims and Arab Americans are screwed in multiple ways. I'm not trying to play down how bad the situation is. Trust me, I'm living through it. It's bad. It keeps me awake at night. Having said that, again, I can only look for, crumbs of hope. And I see, the only hope that I see is members of Congress on the Democratic side who are trying to get a ceasefire and arms embargo, activists in liberal left circles who are trying to pressure Congress to get an arms embargo. And I don't think that those members of Congress and those activists need to be thrown under the bus in order to rightly, let me just be clear for your viewers, rightly punish Kamala Harris. In a perfect world, we would punish Harris and Biden. That's what elections are for, to throw people out who have done bad things. And they have done the worst thing possible, as you've all said, and as I agree, genocide. But if it was a referendum on Harris, then yeah, I'd be voting against her as well. It's not a referendum. It's a freaking binary choice between Trump and Harris. I wish it wasn't. People keep shouting at me, Jill Stein. I don't make the rules. I didn't invent the freaking Electoral College. But it's a binary choice between Trump and Harris. And in that situation, when the genocider on the other side is worse, where we have less leverage with them, where we have less ability to influence them, AOC has this line I'm sure you've all heard. She goes, who would I rather organize under? A black lawyer on Twitter, whose name I'm forgetting right now because I'm old, had a great line. She said, I'm just going to vote for the weakest of the candidates. I want to vote for my weakest opponent, right? Who is the weaker opponent? I believe it's the non-fascist, non-white supremacist, non-Arab racist party. That's what I happen to believe. I just think the world doesn't stop on January 20th. I get all of your arguments. I sympathize with them. In another world, I'd be with you. But I know, I spent 9 years following this guy. I know what an existential threat he'll be to American democracy, to our climate, to Palestinians and and Iranians. And I take Sari's point about building for the long term. But as John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead. I got to focus on January 2025.
I think none of us are disagreeing on the fact that Trump is an existential threat. That's not there's no issue there. We're not.
If he is, then you can't tolerate him as a president, right?
No.
That doesn't make sense.
Of course you can't tolerate him as a president. Of course we can't.
Believe him as existent, and he can't be president under any circumstances.
I get it. I understand. That's why when one goes to vote, one doesn't vote for a fascist like him. I mean, it goes without saying. That's not the issue. The issue is
you vote to stop the fascist. But do you vote to stop?
That's
the
the question. The question, of course, that you're putting a lot of faith. You're putting a lot of faith. I mean, it's interesting. You're putting a lot of faith in the democratic process to stop fascism in America. I mean, as a journalist who deals with structures,
about faith, I have no other alternative.
No,
it's what we have.
Fair enough. But the question I was asking earlier was not about is Trump a fascist? Is Trump? That's not even. We're not even debating that, because I think we're all in full agreement on that point. The question really is, has there been in history, and that's the question I'm asking you to think about. I mean, as I'm sure you've thought about, has there ever been a people who've been obliterated and then asked to go for the people who are not just obliterating them? That's what I'm saying. I think that's a point that I don't think can be elided. I don't think that point.
Which is why I agree with you. Which is why I haven't told people in general to vote for Harris, but I would never go to a family in Dearborn who've lost 100 members of their family and say, "You must vote for Kamala Harris."
Precisely, but that's a tragedy. That's the tragedy of where we are right now.
A horrible situation, right? It's the worst possible. I'm angry at the American political system and the American media and the Democratic Party that we have this choice. I hate the choice ahead of us. I've not said anything positive about the choice ahead of us. But to go back to your point, never have a people had to do that. But I would add that you can't just stop there. You have to say, but also never have a people been asked to vote to end their rights to protest and to vote and to organize and to be able to stop wars. Like I said, I worry that too many people on our side of the argument are very, very passionate about what's happening now, but I'm not thinking about January 21st, 22nd, 23rd. I am. I'm thinking about how am I going to speak out for Palestinians on January 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th? And that leads me to the conclusion that it cannot
Fair enough. And then also just a reminder that those of us who are in academia are also in the real world. I know, I understand the point you made. I get it. But I know, but the mass repression on campuses has taken place.
By the way, in fact, for us in academia, Trump will definitely be worse. There's absolutely no question about that. He will. I mean, the Democrats are bad, but he will definitely be worse for those of us in the American academic system. The repression will be much worse. But just to sum up,
we all agree he's worse in many ways. I think definitely on the Middle East, Sari's not so sure. But we agree he's worse for campuses, worse for democracy, worse for climate, worse for Muslims at home. We agree with all of that. What we're disagreeing on is the act of voting, right? Is the actual emotional, moral, psychological act, which I think is fair enough. For me, though, I think we've turned voting into some kind of we fetishized it as some kind of declaration of principle, as some kind of declaration. I don't see voting in some kind of hallowed, sacred way. To go back to Sari's point, endorsing and voting is a practical means to pick people who are in charge of us. We can hate all of them, we can curse all of them, but ultimately it comes down to who would I want to be governed by and who would I want to try and oppose easier. And that's how I treat voting. But I get that other people don't. I respect other people who say, you know what, I cannot do it. And you know what, haven't decided either. I don't know when I walk in that voting booth what the hell I'll do. I don't, genuinely.
Wait, after all this, you still don't know?
I don't. Well, hold on.
Mehdi, come on, man. You just finished telling us.
I have a very simple answer to that. I don't live in a swing state, so it doesn't really matter what the hell I do. And I've said this to Muslim crowds who ask me, if you don't live in a swing state, do whatever the hell you want.
That's the issue. So it's kind of easier for us in that way.
There you go. What a way to end the show. None of us have to vote for this. It's just the poor souls in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin who have to make these horrible decisions.
Mehdi, thank you very much for coming on. I know you have to run, so thank you very much for joining us on this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed.
Okay, guys, I think we had a really interesting discussion, and it got very heated at the end. As we expected, the question of voting for one mass murderer versus another kind of psychopath who might well go on to do mass murdering. I mean, that choice is difficult to accept. And Osama, as you said, nobody's ever been asked to vote. It's not some kind of dictatorship yet, anyway. You have to actually go out and vote for somebody who's committing genocide to stop a psychopath. I mean, it should make us all very angry that these are the choices. But I think the point that I'd like to ask you guys is to come back to it. And I know, Sarah, you had a very specific point that you were making. But the question, if we take it all out, if we boil his point down, it's fine. this is genocide. He is against it, etc. All these things. But on January 21, who do you want to be there? If it's Trump and we're all saying Trump is worse on 98% of the issues, there is an actual choice to be made in a sense. So what do you think of that? What do you guys think of that? As opposed to the intellectual argument around it.
But I would disagree. By the way, you both said this thing about this is the first time. It's not the first time. I mean, it's the first time about genocide, yes.
Well, someone said it, so I was just
Arab
repeating what someone
Americans.
said.
I know, but I would remind you both: Arab Americans have consistently been in the position of being told to vote for people who clearly have a racist
No, but genocide.
hostility
No,
against Arabs.
in
Genocide.
this
It makes it worse.
specific
I was
genocide.
talking about genocide.
Genocide in particular.
Okay,
Genocide.
it's fine.
Specifically.
Fine, then, but that's nevertheless that's like a worse version of the same. And that's like qualitatively
No,
worse.
it's
in a way,
extremes.
right?
It's an extreme version that I'm
the
fairly
same-
convinced
of the same
Yeah,
kind
but
of
my
we've always-
point, can I just to answer Karim's question? My point in this is that I understand this business of being told, okay, who do you want to be under? But I think that sort of misses the point. To me, at least, that misses the point. Especially, and it's not because we're living in academic ivory towers. It's in the end, there's a consistency of American policy that gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And the point is that it's not a question of like, who do I, is it, he kept saying Trump is going to be more genocidal than Harris, Biden Harris.
no equally.
Maybe, possibly.
In other words, the same. In other words, that the genocide that he's had genocide. His argument was that he had these genocidal things anyway in Yemen and other places, as he puts it. But that also 99% of all the other issues, including domestically and Islam and Arab Americans and all that kind of stuff, will be much worse.
No, I get the domestic argument. I get the environmental. I get all that stuff. I totally get that argument.
Yeah, but in voting, this is what it's about. He's talking about the broader thing. You're talking about one issue.
Yes, I'm talking. Well, I'm not just talking about one. I'm talking about one issue from the perspective of Arabs who are being asked to vote. As I said, that this has never happened before. Sadi's point, of course, is absolutely correct. Sadi, your point is that we're always being told you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. And we're always told this. But having said that, having been told that for decades and decades and decades, we end up with Biden-Harris, a Democratic administration that is carrying out a genocide. I mean, so the argument goes both ways. There's an argument to say that the system is so utterly rigged, it's so corrupt, and it's so inherently anti-Arab. The idea of voting and is at some level, you could argue there's a real question. Is there not?
No, that's exactly what I would say.
I understand.
I
understand
refuse to
your point.
participate in this process that is premised on my own dehumanization. I'm not. Why would I play a game premised on my own dehumanization?
I think one can vote locally, but anyway, these are separate issues. I think
locally in Congress are different, and those things are, for example, the domestic issues are much more under the purview of Congress, for example, or the courts or whatever, than the foreign stuff, which the executive has essentially untrammeled, unreserved power to conduct as more or less as the executive sees fit. That's not the case for domestic stuff.
I think we're having. I think there is a kind of there's different arguments that are being made. He's talking at a practical. Just to go back to Mehdi, he's talking about a practical argument to say who would you rather be there on January 21 or 25, versus.
Neither is the answer. For me, the answer is neither.
No, but you see then you're back to the argument of living in an ivory tower, because it is not.
No, I'm not living in an ivory.
It's one
I'm
of them.
But
it is one person. One person will be there. That's absurd to say neither. That's you're staking out an intellectual, moral position, which we all agree with here, and I think most people will.
No,
agree
you
with
can
it.
go, Habibi. You can go. One can go vote. One can go vote and vote down ballot all they want. Nobody has to not vote.
Talking about presidency.
Okay,
Let's
you're
talk
asking,
about presidency.
as I said, now for our viewers and listeners, as I said, as an Arab, it is impossible. It's true. Of course, now I'm living in California, as everyone knows. We're living in, Kasedi and I live in California, so that's not a swing state as such. So, but even that aside, the idea of asking me to go vote for somebody who's actually endorsed my genocide, the genocide of my people, is impossible. I'm not doing it. It's out of the question.
Who's saying
no? But I think that's that.
No, some people are saying that. By the way,
that trumps. No pun intended. But that trumps the idea of I'm not going to vote for Trump. I mean, we shouldn't talk about what we're voting, what we're not voting. But ultimately, the question Mehdi is asking, and a bigger thing is, it comes down ultimately to domestic questions. There's no question the Republican Party is awful on domestic issues, anti-education, overtly racist, overtly anti-Muslim, overtly anti-Arab, overtly anti-Palestinian, overtly anti-everything, as far as I can tell. Correct? That's what they are. So we understand that the Republicans are worse. We just need to look at their House Committee on Education just to see how appalling
Education,
the Republic.
guys. Trump will send in the National Guards or
Yes,
whatever
I
they
said
are.
that.
I'm telling you.
I said
I'm
that to
telling
him.
you.
He is worse.
So,
he is
there's no
worse.
question that he's worse.
For universities, he'll be worse. Yeah, there's no question.
But can we get out of this? This is almost like an endless argument, because there are those of us who are going to say, no, my ethics. In the end, we're all ethical beings too. So
He said
the
that
question,
too, by the way.
Yeah, I know he said that, but the question is ultimately to step back. This question of Karim, this is something, since you're the one of us, you're among the three of us, you're the one who is most. I always feel you're the one who teaches us the most about realpolitik and about these questions. Mehdi kept raising this point about having influence, about having influence. And what I don't understand is, how does one have influence in a system, a corporate structure that is inherently, ultimately anti-democratic, in the sense that we all know it's the donors who run. We all know it's the large corporations. We all know it's the military industrial tech complex.
Wait, you're talking about the government or the media? So
both the government and the media. The idea of what does it mean to have influence? I guess I'm always wondering. I mean, there's a question.
That's what I'm saying. He was talking about media. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, but even in the media, I mean, so what kind of influence does one have? And what kind of choices these are legitimate questions. What kind of influence does one aspire to have? And then what kind of choices does one have to make in terms of being strategic, being tactical, thinking about certain words or phrases, or in the case of Kamala Harris versus Trump, political choices one makes? Isn't that the question that was raised in this?
I think it's a good question, and I doubt anybody's going to come up with a final answer, because we do compartmentalize our intellectual and moral and even political ways of thinking to the very practicality of, and ultimately somebody's going to be in office, and that's where he's talking about. But let me ask you a sort of a similar thing in our own world. You guys have been dealing with these. I'm a different kind of thing, but the two of you have been dealing in this last year with the question of your campuses and university and all the kind of pressure, the pressure the police is at, but really the pressure comes from above, right? From the university presidents, from the government. I don't, whatever it is. There's people at the very top.
Donors and
Okay,
politicians.
fine, but donors, within the institution, filtered through the presidents and the whatever they're
the
called.
board,
the upper administration.
Okay, yeah. Right. So it's donors, but filtered through institutionally through the boards. Okay, so are you? But you guys are both dissenting voices. I mean, and there are others, but I mean, you two are both dissenting voices within your own institutions. And so the question would be: is it better in this case for you to be dissenting from within, or for you to say, well, universities have become, fascist universities, I'm just going to leave and go do something else, and then sort of sit on a sidewalk and talk and try to influence somebody there? Where are you better off influencing?
No, obviously, we are dissenting from within, right?
Okay,
but the
so
point is,
so it's a similar kind of thing.
Hang on, no, it's yes, it is. The structures are similar in a way, and of course, there are plenty of academics from our kind of background who will be much, 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 much more careful and calculating as to what they say, what they don't say, and who therefore aspire to have even more influence with the upper administration and that kind of thing. In a way that, for example, I know whatever. That doesn't have to be personalized, but the point is, you see what I'm saying? Like there are prices to be paid. Now, Mehdi's point about them applies. You're kidding me. You're exactly right. The similar kind of structures go for the media world, and I have to say, I mean, that he is right. I mean, let's talk about realpolitik. This is the price of admission to get to sitting in that chair in some major network for however long one is able to sit there.
But the question, Seti, is what I mean, you're absolutely right, Seti and Karim. The question is, what influence does he actually, or does any of these, even dissenting journalists from within, like Mehdi, what influence does it have to actually change?
It's the same
policy?
influence as when you or I or Karim, when we write articles or when we show up on Al Jazeera or BBC or whatever. We have that 1 minute to try to make. That's the same.
This podcast. What is it? I mean, what is the
podcast? Exactly. Yeah.
You're missing the point. I'm not dismissing the. I'm saying his whole argument, Mehdi's argument, seemed to be that by framing in certain ways, you reach a much wider audience. You're able to have influence. And my question is, as opposed to the academics or the left, as he kept putting, I mean, I know that this is shorthand. He's not dismissing all academics, certainly not. nor is he dismissing the progressive. Obviously, he's not doing that either. I mean, to be fair to Mehdi, it just seems to me that the question of influence is one that we need to think about a little bit more, because in the end, I don't dismiss his influence. I don't dismiss the fact that he reaches out. I don't dismiss that at all. Nor do I dismiss the social media people out there who don't make the same kind of choices that Mehdi makes. I think these are all working. I think these are all working in different registers.
Yes, I agree.
That's my point. So I don't think it's. I think the way he framed it was it's either this or it's that. And I don't necessarily think.
No,
that's
I didn't.
I don't think he was saying. I don't think he was saying that. No.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood.
I don't think he said that. I think in terms of the influence, the impact, because you asked Mehdi several times about impact, and the question is, it's not necessarily
not me.
Okay, here, but sort of, but impact as a big word. I mean, you could be impacting the public discussion, not policy. Okay, so in the end, what are we all doing? None of us are going to influence, and it's not the media's job specifically to influence public policy, nor is it an academic's job to influence public policy, unless you're specifically working in that and in a particular thing. You're influencing the public debates. And the hope is, in a supposedly democratic country, is that the public debates then influence the voters, which then influence the way things are done. Now, we know from the American system that doesn't work anymore. Or if it ever worked, it's not working now, that's for sure. And that you've got this big monster in the room, which is called the donors. Doesn't matter who they are, the donors, and in whether it's the NRA in that issue, or in this case, the AIPAC or whoever it is, and the evangelicals,
the arms dealers, and all
the arms dealers, all these people. This is the way the American system works. And so I think, just to finish with this point, I think it's the main argument that he's trying to say, which I think we need to think about seriously, is which of these terrible choices allows you to at least organize in your little corner to fight another day. Wait,
now you're talking about elections. Now you're talking about
but I don't agree with that. I think that way of framing it is so. It's
saying how his argument. I'm not saying it's correct.
I understand. I understand that is his argument, and one has to be fair to his argument and say, and he expressed his argument. It's not that we're not going to rephrase his argument for him. He expressed it perfectly well, I think, and with passion and with conviction. The question really is for us and for all our listeners and viewers ultimately is, it's not about being egotistical. It's about being an ethical person. What are the ethical choices that one makes given the intellectual, academic, contextual, historical backgrounds that we see happening right now with Gaza and all that stuff. So I think whoever is in power, we're going to continue doing what we can do. That's the reality. I don't think that's my point.
I think we also one last point that I think we also have to accept our positionality. I mean, you guys. I mean, I'm not even in America. I have a whole other story, but you guys are in very privileged positions. So you're not going to be. You guys are very high profile, tenured professors. You're not going to be. You're the last. If universities shut down, if everything in the world goes, you guys are going to be at the last row to be taken out. So there's a lot of people.
The last row is going to be the Ivy Leagues. Let me assure you.
No, you know what I mean. But no, there's a lot of people who are much more vulnerable, where these things will impact them very much more quickly than us.
Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely, 100%. That's why nobody's disagreeing that Trump is going to be a catastrophe. I don't doubt for a second Trump is going to be a catastrophe. Nor do I dismiss the fact that those of our colleagues who are in more vulnerable positions are going to be impacted first and more heavily, and of course,
I don't mean colleagues. I mean like anybody in society, not just talking about
in society as well. I understand, but the point is, of course, they're already being impacted. As you know perfectly well, they already are being impacted. But ultimately, it comes down to the real question, as I said, is for our listeners and viewers who are Palestinian or Lebanese, and you're asking them to go vote for. I mean, that's really the question of, to go back to the Trump-Harris thing. Trump-Harris thing. That question of asking somebody to vote. No people have ever been asked, as far as I'm aware, to vote for the people actively engaged in genocide. That's never happened in history. I'm sorry, that never has. I think that's a point that can't just be swept under the rug.
No, I agree.
I agree. That's where it comes from.
And Mehdi agreed. To be fair to him, he agreed.
He agreed as well, and I think we all agree. And I personally, say it now. I mean, I wouldn't. I'm not voting for any of these people. So. It's easy. It's an easy choice because intellectually, morally, and everything else, my choice doesn't have an impact because even if I voted, it wouldn't be in a swing state in any case. So it doesn't really matter. The American system comes down to a handful of districts in a handful of states. That's it. The rest of us don't matter in the election. That's the American system. And those
No, they
districts,
matter
those
locally.
areas,
They matter locally. They matter
not,
locally.
I'm
more
talking
so.
at
No,
the
we're talking about the
presidential
president
level.
here.
I'm talking at the presidential level. Don't
Yeah. Yeah.
keep
Fair,
telling me
fair
the
points.
local. We can have a different part on the local level. We're talking at the presidential level. So I think, guys, we've, unless there's anything else you want to add about the discussion, on Gaza itself, or I think, and I think it's all going to be, it's all related, and the election is in a couple of weeks now, and it's not going to be pleasant either way. And then, last night and even today, the Israelis were bombing the hell out of Beirut and various parts of Lebanon. They've committed another massacre in schools in Gaza. That's not going to stop. I don't see that stopping. Blinken has just gone. He's started his so-called Middle East tour. Talking through both sides of his face and his mouth, and just
He took his guitar with him.
he took his guitar and spewing poison basically, and sort of trying to convince everybody that he wants a ceasefire.
But
and
only
peace.
after they sent an Israeli to mediate between Israel and Lebanon.
So this is the situation, and we'll resume this another time. So take care, guys.
Good to see you guys. Bye bye.
Bye.